In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where every driveway was perfectly lined with trimmed hedges and every mailbox gleamed under the afternoon sun, life had a way of appearing almost too orderly. The houses looked nearly identical, painted in the same palette of beige, cream, and muted gray, each sporting two-car garages and carefully measured lawns. It was the kind of neighborhood where the HOA had rules for everything. Trash bins had to be brought in before dusk, holiday decorations were restricted to certain dates, and parking regulations were posted in bold, unforgiving print. For most residents, it was a comfortable place to live, a picture of stability and control. But for one man, whose quiet routine was suddenly disrupted, it became the battleground of a daily war he never expected to fight. The trouble started with a neighbor, a woman who had lived in the neighborhood for years. She carried herself with the kind of entitlement that made every interaction feel like a lecture, the type of neighbor who watched with eagle eyes to make sure everyone else followed the rules, while conveniently excusing herself from them. Her driveway was wide enough to hold two cars comfortably, yet for reasons no one understood, she began parking her vehicle directly in front of her neighbor's driveway, effectively trapping his car in place. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Perhaps she had guests. Perhaps her garage was full of storage. Maybe she just parked there once out of convenience. But when the same scene repeated itself the next day and the next, the pattern became undeniable. She wasn't simply parking. She was making a point. Every morning, when he left for work, he would step outside to find her sedan angled just enough to block his driveway, and every evening, when he returned, the car was still there, unmoved. He would have to wait until she decided to go somewhere, often late into the night before he could pull his car out. His freedom of movement, his daily routine, was now subject to her whims. Frustration grew with each passing day. He considered knocking on her door, but stories of her temper were well known. Neighbors whispered about her confrontations over untrimmed shrubs, misplaced trash cans, and even children playing too loudly in their own yards. She was the kind of neighbor who lived for control, and confronting her directly promised nothing but escalation. The man tried patience first. He hoped she would stop on her own. He left polite notes on her windshield, written in careful, measured words. The notes disappeared, but her behavior did not. Soon, the notes were ignored entirely, left crumpled on the ground by his mailbox. What made it worse was the HOA's silence. Complaints were filed, emails were sent, but the association moved slowly, bogged down by procedures, forms, and endless waiting periods. They insisted they would investigate, but nothing changed. In a neighborhood where even a misplaced lawn ornament could trigger a fine, her blatant disregard for parking rules went unchecked. It wasn't long before the man began documenting everything. He took pictures of her car blocking the driveway, time-stamped and organized in folders. He recorded videos showing how he couldn't back out. He created a detailed log of every day the obstruction occurred. It wasn't just petty annoyance anymore. It was evidence. Evidence for a battle he knew was coming. The situation escalated further when her behavior grew bolder. She began leaving her car for longer stretches, sometimes an entire weekend, while she disappeared elsewhere. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every time she parked, her smug satisfaction was almost visible in the way she positioned her car at the edge of his driveway, wheels slightly turned inward, like a locked gate. His patience had limits. The man wasn't someone who enjoyed conflict, but even the most tolerant person has a breaking point. He began researching the laws in his area, learning that blocking a driveway was, in fact, a violation enforceable by the city. Tow trucks could be called, tickets could be issued, and repeat offenders could face hefty fines. And yet he hesitated. Calling a tow truck was no small step. It wasn't just about moving a car, it was about starting a war. In a neighborhood where reputations lingered for years, a move like that would ripple through every house on the block. But each time he saw his driveway blocked, each time he felt the sting of her arrogance, the idea of revenge grew more appealing. By the end of the second week, he was ready. He had everything he needed: photos, videos, and an ironclad record of her behavior. He even had the number of a towing company saved on his phone. All that remained was the decision to make the call. The final push came on a Monday morning. He had an early appointment, one he couldn't afford to miss. He stepped outside, already dressed, already running behind schedule, and there it was, the same car in the same spot, sealing his driveway shut like a locked gate. It was no longer an inconvenience, it was sabotage. He stared at the car, the metallic paint reflecting the rising sun, and something inside him hardened. This wasn't just about parking anymore. This was about respect, about being pushed too far by someone who believed the rules didn't apply to them. He reached for his phone, scrolling to the number he had saved. His hand hovered for only a moment before he pressed the call button. The line rang, and within minutes, the wheels of revenge were set into motion. The tow truck driver listened carefully as the man explained the situation, his voice steady but edged with months of suppressed frustration. The driver assured him it was no problem, that they dealt with situations like this every day. He promised to arrive shortly. The man stood at his window, watching as the minutes ticked by, anticipation building with each passing second. He knew what was about to happen would change everything. The neighborhood, the balance of power, the unspoken rules of their suburban battlefield. Everything was about to shift. And then, at the far end of the street, the unmistakable shape of a tow truck appeared, its lights flashing faintly in the morning haze. The stage was set, the evidence collected, the tow truck rolling closer with every second. The war with his neighbor was about to begin. The sound of the tow truck's engine rumbled through the quiet neighborhood, breaking the usual morning calm that hung over the manicured lawns and identical driveways. A few curtains shifted as curious neighbors peeked outside, their morning routines interrupted by the sight of flashing lights crawling slowly down the street. It wasn't often that anything disrupted the monotonous order of suburbia, and the arrival of a tow truck promised something worth watching. The man stood by his window, his heart beating faster than he expected. He had imagined this moment countless times during the past 2 weeks, and now that it was happening, it felt almost surreal. The truck pulled up alongside the offending car, its size dwarfing the shiny sedan that had been his daily torment. The driver climbed out, efficient and unfazed, as though this were just another job in a long line of driveway disputes. The man didn't need to say much. The documentation spoke for itself. Photographs, timestamps, and the car's position across the driveway painted an undeniable picture. The driver gave a small nod, pulled on his gloves, and got to work. Chains clinked, metal scraped, and the hydraulic whine of machinery filled the air. The sedan shifted slightly as the tow truck secured it, the once smug blockade now reduced to nothing more than cargo. The man's pulse steadied as he watched the process. Each second felt like justice taking form, each sound of tightening chains like the restoration of balance. It wasn't just about freeing his driveway, it was about sending a message. But as the sedan lifted slowly onto the flatbed, the moment of satisfaction was pierced by another sound, a door slamming shut. Across the street, the neighbor emerged. She was still in her robe, hair tied back hastily, her expression sharp and filled with disbelief. For a second, she simply stood there, taking in the sight of her car being hauled away, her eyes narrowing as if the scene itself was a personal insult. Then, with all the fury she was known for, she stormed toward the tow truck, her voice rising above the mechanical whine. The man stayed inside, resisting the urge to step out. He had no desire to confront her directly, not now. He wanted the evidence, the law, and the process to speak for him. He remained behind the glass, watching as the driver calmly continued his work, despite the storm of complaints, accusations, and demands hurled his way. The tow truck driver, seasoned by countless encounters with irate car owners, barely flinched. He gestured toward the markings on the road, explained the law, and pointed out the obstruction of the driveway. The neighbor's fury only intensified. Her hands flew in sharp gestures. Her voice cracked with indignation, but the outcome was already sealed. The car was chained, lifted, and loaded. As the tow truck began to pull away, her shouts followed it down the street, echoing against the neatly painted houses. The man could feel the tension in the air, the invisible weight of every curtain that had moved earlier. The neighborhood was watching. Everyone had seen her car towed, and everyone had seen her reaction. The silent reputation she had built over the years, as the self-appointed enforcer of rules, was beginning to crumble. When the truck finally disappeared from view, silence returned, heavy and expectant. The neighbor stood in the street for several long moments, arms crossed tightly, her glare fixed on the man's driveway, as though she could burn through walls with sheer spite. Then, with a sharp pivot, she retreated back into her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the glass panes. The man exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. His driveway was clear, the blockade gone, and the first strike in the battle had been made. But he knew it wasn't over. People like her didn't accept defeat quietly. The tow truck may have solved the immediate problem, but it had also lit a fuse that would burn in unpredictable ways. The rest of the day passed in uneasy calm. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones when they crossed paths, the story already spreading from yard to yard. By evening, the incident had transformed into a neighborhood legend, each retelling adding its own flavor of speculation and judgment. Some praised the man for finally standing up to her, while others warned that he had awakened a storm he couldn't contain. Late that night, as the man settled into bed, he heard faint noises outside. He peeked through his blinds and saw her, standing at the edge of his driveway, arms folded, staring at the empty space where her car had been. The street lamp cast long shadows across her figure, and for a moment it looked as though she was calculating something, planning her next move. Then, without a word, she disappeared back into her house, leaving the man uneasy. The next morning, her car was back. Not in her driveway, not in front of her house, but once again angled deliberately across his. The sedan, freshly retrieved from the impound lot, had returned to its post like nothing had happened. Only this time, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was defiance. The man's jaw tightened as he stared at the blockade. She hadn't been deterred by the tow truck. She had been emboldened. The message was clear. This wasn't over, and if anything, she was ready to escalate. With his driveway blocked again and his patience fraying, the man realized the situation had entered a new phase. It wasn't simply about one car anymore. It was about a battle of wills, a war for control of the neighborhood's unspoken order. He knew what came next wouldn't be easy, but the die had been cast, and neither side was backing down. The war with his neighbor had only just begun. The following days unfolded like a chess match, each move calculated, each counter-move laced with unspoken defiance. What had begun as a simple parking dispute had evolved into something larger, an unrelenting struggle for dominance between two neighbors who could no longer coexist peacefully. The woman's decision to park across the driveway again was more than stubbornness, it was a statement. She wanted everyone to know that she could not be controlled, that even the humiliation of watching her car towed away would not deter her. Her car sat there like a fortress, daring anyone to challenge her authority. The man, however, was not deterred either. He had tasted the satisfaction of reclaiming his driveway once, and he knew it was possible to do it again. Still, he recognized that this was no longer a matter of simply calling a tow truck. The first time had caught her off guard. The second time would only escalate the conflict further, drawing more eyes, more whispers, and more tension from neighbors who preferred the illusion of suburban harmony. Each morning, he documented her car with renewed precision. Photos and videos were captured from multiple angles, timestamps carefully noted. He kept a detailed log, ensuring that every infraction was preserved for when the HOA or local authorities could no longer ignore the situation. But beyond documentation, he began to prepare for a longer battle. He read up on local ordinances, memorizing the exact statutes that prohibited blocking driveways. He learned about fines, enforcement mechanisms, and even small claims processes that could recoup towing costs. If she wanted a war, he would fight it with paperwork, persistence, and the letter of the law. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had split into factions. Some quietly supported the man, sympathizing with his frustration. Others, wary of the woman's temper, kept their opinions muted, though their silence carried its own kind of judgment. Whispers passed through fences and over hedges, every conversation tinged with the latest development. The once idyllic cul-de-sac had become a stage for suburban drama, and every resident was an unwilling audience. The woman herself seemed to thrive on the spectacle. She was seen pacing the street, her robe replaced with a sharp outfit, her expression hardened into a mask of control. She spoke loudly to anyone who would listen, twisting the story into her favor. She claimed harassment, unfair targeting, and conspiracies against her. She painted herself as the victim of an overzealous neighbor, omitting, of course, the fact that her car had been the aggressor in the first place. The man remained silent. He avoided confrontation, knowing that direct exchanges would only fuel her fire. Instead, he let the evidence build quietly, brick by brick, a fortress of facts that would withstand her manipulations. But she did not stop at parking. Her retaliation spread in subtle, insidious ways. Trash bags, ripped open and scattered, began appearing near his curb. Small dents appeared in his mailbox. Sprinkler heads on his lawn were mysteriously damaged, leaving uneven patches of grass. Nothing was overt enough to prove her involvement, but the pattern was unmistakable. Her message was clear. She was willing to escalate beyond parking. The man felt the strain of it, the way each new act of sabotage ate at his patience. But he refused to retaliate in kind. He would not stoop to her level. Instead, he installed cameras, motion-activated, discreet, and positioned to cover his driveway, lawn, and mailbox. If she wanted to play dirty, he would capture every move she made. The cameras brought him a new kind of reassurance. He no longer had to rely solely on his own eyes. Technology became his witness, an impartial observer that would document every petty act. The recordings piled up quickly, her car arriving late at night to block his driveway, her figure lingering near his mailbox, her shadow crossing his lawn. Each clip was another weapon in his arsenal. Still, the pressure mounted. The neighborhood tension was palpable. Children whispered about the war on the corner. Parents hurried them inside when the woman's voice rose too sharply in the street, and the HOA, inundated with complaints, finally began to stir. Letters were drafted, warnings issued, and meetings scheduled. Yet the woman, unrelenting, tore up the notices and boasted that no one could force her hand. The man knew that the situation was approaching a breaking point. The cameras had given him confidence, but they had also revealed the depth of her obsession. She wasn't merely retaliating. She was fixated, determined to prove that she controlled the narrative, the street, and the neighbors around her. The next tow call came not on a morning of urgency, but on a night of principle. The man had returned home late, exhausted, only to find her car once again sealing off his driveway. His patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. He didn't wait for morning, didn't weigh the optics of another spectacle. He simply dialed the tow company, his voice calm but final. When the truck arrived, its lights illuminated the street like a beacon. Neighbors peeked out once more, drawn by the glow. And once again, her car was lifted, its arrogance stripped away by chains and machinery. This time, however, she was not there to protest. Her lights were off, her house silent. The scene played out without interruption, the sedan disappearing into the night as quietly as it had arrived. But silence did not mean surrender. The man knew better. He stood in his driveway long after the truck left, the night air heavy with anticipation. She would not accept this without retaliation. The cameras would capture her response, but he could already feel it looming. The war was no longer confined to driveways and tow trucks. It had spread into the fabric of the neighborhood, infecting every interaction, every whispered conversation, every wary glance. The man understood now that this was not a battle of convenience. It was a battle of pride, one that neither side intended to lose. And as he turned to head inside, a thought crossed his mind that chilled him. Wars like this rarely ended cleanly. The second tow shook the neighborhood more deeply than the first. The first time had seemed like a rare spectacle, a sudden disruption that would fade once the dust settled. The second time, however, made it clear that the conflict was not an isolated incident. It was an ongoing war, and the woman's silence that night was only the calm before her storm. By the following morning, her retaliation began. When the man stepped outside, his lawn was littered with shredded flyers, crumpled paper scattered like confetti across the grass. At first, it seemed like random litter, but a closer look revealed that each paper carried the same message, bold words accusing him of harassment, bullying, and cruelty. It was a crude attempt at public shaming, printed in large block letters and clearly designed to spread a narrative. He gathered them quietly, one by one, careful not to give her the satisfaction of a visible reaction. The cameras had caught everything. The shadowy figure in the night, the slow scattering of papers across his lawn. Her face was blurred by darkness, but the outline of her robe and the way she moved betrayed her identity. Another piece of evidence, another brick in the fortress he was building. The neighborhood awoke to whispers once again. Some found the flyers tucked under their doormats. Others spotted them blowing down the street. The woman had gone on the offensive, trying to twist the story in her favor, painting herself as the target of unjust attacks. But in her attempt to seize control of the narrative, she only deepened the divide. Neighbors who once avoided choosing sides began to lean toward the man, quietly disgusted by her antics. Others, fearful of her wrath, remained silent, unwilling to risk becoming her next target. The cul-de-sac, once bound by the unspoken code of suburban civility, was now fractured into camps, and every gesture, every wave, every smile, every avoided glance carried the weight of unspoken allegiance. The man, meanwhile, focused on strategy. He uploaded the video clips from his cameras to a private folder, carefully curated and labeled. He shared them selectively, starting with the HOA board, whose patience with her was running thin. Then, almost inevitably, the clips began to spread further. A neighbor's relative, fascinated by the drama, posted one on social media. Within hours, the video of her car being towed was circulating far beyond the neighborhood. The internet did what it always does. It latched on to the spectacle. Comments flooded in, strangers across the country weighing in with outrage, amusement, and endless stories of their own Karen neighbors. Memes were made, screenshots shared, and before long the video had racked up thousands of views. The once private conflict was now a public performance, amplified by the digital echo chamber. The woman was furious. She stormed through the neighborhood, ranting about slander and privacy violations, threatening lawsuits she had no real intention of filing. Her anger, however, only fueled the fire. The more she lashed out, the more the internet mocked her, immortalizing her tantrums in clips and captions. She had wanted control of the narrative, but the narrative had slipped through her fingers and taken on a life of its own. For the man, the sudden online attention was both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, he finally felt the weight of public opinion on his side, a tide of strangers cheering him on, validating his frustration. On the other, he worried about the escalation it would bring. She was not the type to retreat when cornered. She was the type to fight harder, to dig deeper into her arsenal of spite. And fight harder she did. The next week became a campaign of pettiness. Her car, once again, blocked his driveway, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes brazenly during the day. She stood outside with arms crossed, daring him to call the tow truck again. Trash appeared mysteriously in his yard. Loud music blared from her windows late into the night, always timed to disrupt his sleep. She even placed orange traffic cones along the curb, claiming that the public street in front of her house was reserved. Every act was recorded, documented, and added to the growing archive of evidence. Every escalation became another piece of content, another story to be shared. The internet that mocked her now waited eagerly for each new installment, each fresh display of entitlement. What had begun as a quiet neighborhood dispute was now a viral saga, unfolding in real time for thousands of strangers. The man tried to live as normally as possible, but normalcy was slipping away. Trips to the store became strategic, planned around the likelihood of his driveway being blocked. Mowing the lawn became an exercise in endurance, done under the watchful glare of his neighbor standing at her window. Even simple walks to the mailbox were tinged with tension, each step taken under the weight of her scrutiny. And yet, through it all, he remained calm. He did not shout, did not retaliate, did not give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. His revenge was patience, his weapon was evidence, and his ally was the growing chorus of voices online who turned her antics into ridicule. The HOA, pressured by the attention and the mounting complaints, finally began to act more decisively. They issued formal citations, threatened fines, and even hinted at legal action if her behavior continued. For the first time, she faced consequences not just from her neighbor, but from the very organization she had once used as her shield. Still, she did not back down. Her pride would not allow it. She doubled down, her actions more desperate, her rants more unhinged. The sight of the tow truck had wounded her ego, but the sight of her behavior plastered across the internet had humiliated her. And humiliation for someone like her was unbearable. The man knew the climax was approaching. The tension was too high, the escalation too sharp, for the conflict to fizzle out quietly. Something had to give. Either she would finally cross a line that forced the authorities to intervene, or she would attempt one last act of retaliation that would define the war once and for all. And late one night, as the cameras silently recorded, that act began to take shape. The neighborhood had grown accustomed to the sound of tension. The woman's loud voice, the man's quiet restraint, the occasional appearance of the tow truck, these had become part of the daily rhythm. But as the weeks dragged on, the conflict grew darker. What had started as a war of inconvenience was transforming into something sharper, heavier, and undeniably dangerous. It began with small, suspicious signs. One morning, the man found scratches down the side of his car, long streaks carved into the paint with deliberate cruelty. Another day, a strange, pungent liquid had been poured across his driveway, seeping into the cracks of the pavement. The smell lingered for hours, acrid and foul, impossible to ignore. The cameras caught movements in the night. Figures lingering near his property, shadows crossing the driveway at odd hours. Sometimes it was her, recognizable by her stance and her hurried pace. Other times it seemed like guests, people she had brought in to amplify her campaign. They were careful, but not careful enough. Each clip, each blurry frame, added to the growing case file the man was building. Her desperation was becoming obvious to everyone. The HOA, overwhelmed with complaints and footage, issued formal violations that threatened heavy fines. Yet instead of backing down, she grew bolder. She treated each letter like a trophy, waving it in the air as she shouted about corruption and conspiracies. She told anyone who would listen that she was the victim of harassment, of stalking, of an organized plot to destroy her reputation. But her reputation was already destroyed, and not by her neighbor, but by herself. The internet had embraced her as the caricature she had become. Clips of her raging in the street circulated widely, each video more outrageous than the last. Commenters labeled her Driveway Karen, and the name stuck. Memes flooded social platforms, mocking her with captions, sound bites, and parodies. For the man, the viral fame was surreal. He hadn't sought attention, hadn't asked to be the star of an online spectacle, but the tide of public interest swept him up nonetheless. His quiet battle for peace had become entertainment for strangers. Every time his doorbell camera captured her antics, people online laughed, cheered, and demanded more. It was vindication, but it was also exposure, a constant reminder that his private life was no longer entirely his own. And then came the night when she crossed a line no one expected. It was after midnight, the street cloaked in silence, when motion sensors activated and cameras flickered to life. The woman emerged from her house, not in her robe or casual wear, but dressed in dark clothing, her face partially obscured by a hood. In her hand, she carried a canister, the nozzle glinting faintly under the street lamp. She moved quickly, crouching low as she approached his driveway. The footage later showed her spraying the base of his garage door, dousing it in liquid. She emptied the canister across the threshold, her movements frantic, deliberate. The smell that lingered the next morning told the truth. Gasoline. She had escalated beyond pettiness. This was no longer about parking or pride. This was dangerous. But the cameras hadn't just captured her actions. They had captured everything: the approach, the spray, the unmistakable identity of the person holding the canister. And as she slinked back into her house, unaware that every second had been recorded in high definition, she had sealed her own fate. When the man reviewed the footage, a chill settled over him. He had expected sabotage, vandalism, even harassment. But this was an entirely different level. It wasn't just illegal. It was reckless. Reckless enough to endanger not only his home, but the safety of the entire neighborhood. If she had gone further, if she had struck a match, dozens of lives could have been at risk. He contacted the authorities immediately. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Police arrived that afternoon, calm but firm, knocking on her door with the weight of the law at their backs. She ranted and raved as they questioned her, denied everything, accused her neighbor of fabricating the footage. But technology does not lie. The video was too clear, too damning. Neighbors gathered quietly at their windows, watching as the spectacle unfolded. The woman, once the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood order, now stood on her porch, shouting as officers pressed her for answers. Her voice cracked under the weight of her own fury, her gestures wild, her denials desperate. And then, for the first time, the sight everyone had quietly wondered if they'd ever see. Handcuffs. The street was silent as she was led to the patrol car, her protests echoing into the night. Curtains twitched, whispers spread, and the cul-de-sac that had once feared her dominance now stood in quiet astonishment. The balance of power had shifted completely, her reign of intimidation shattered in a single evening. The man didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He simply stood inside his home, watching through the blinds as justice unfolded. Relief washed over him, but it was tempered by exhaustion. The months of tension had taken their toll, and though she was finally facing consequences, the scars of the ordeal remained. The neighborhood, however, was electrified. Word spread quickly, online, offline, everywhere. The video of her spraying gasoline made its way to the internet, and within hours, it exploded. What had once been a viral curiosity was now a viral scandal. News outlets picked up the story, commentators dissected every detail, and strangers debated her downfall across forums and social feeds. For the man, the sudden attention was overwhelming. His quiet life had become a public narrative, his battle with his neighbor transformed into a cautionary tale of entitlement, escalation, and the power of evidence. Strangers praised him for his patience, for his refusal to stoop to her level, for his reliance on facts instead of fury. But as the dust began to settle, a new question loomed. What came next? Would she be gone for good? Would the neighborhood finally return to peace? Or would her legacy linger, her influence haunting the street long after she had left? The war had reached its climax, but the ending was still unwritten. The days that followed her arrest were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. The cul-de-sac, once tense and divided, was suddenly united by a shared sense of relief. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, the silence of the street no longer heavy with anticipation of the next conflict. But though the woman was gone, the shadow of her presence lingered. News spread quickly, both locally and online. The footage of her spraying gasoline across her neighbor's garage became the centerpiece of countless viral posts. Headlines branded her with nicknames that would follow her forever: Driveway Karen, the HOA Menace, the Neighbor from Hell. Clips of her shouting matches, her car being towed, and finally her handcuffed walk to the patrol car were stitched together into montages that racked up millions of views. What had once been a quiet battle between two neighbors had now become a spectacle that strangers across the world dissected, mocked, and shared. Comment sections were flooded with jokes, sympathy, and moral lessons about entitlement, patience, and the power of cameras. The man found himself at the center of a story he had never asked to tell, his quiet life now a digital saga played out for millions. The HOA, once slow and ineffective, scrambled to save face. They issued statements condemning her actions, citing their repeated warnings and violations as proof that they had done everything within their authority. But the neighbors knew the truth, that it had been the man's persistence, his careful documentation, and his refusal to give up that had brought her to justice. The HOA's role had been little more than reluctant paperwork. As weeks passed, the legal system moved forward. She faced charges for vandalism, harassment, and reckless endangerment. The gasoline footage alone was enough to ensure serious consequences, but when paired with the mountain of evidence the man had collected, her defense crumbled. Court dates came and went, each one reported in hushed conversations across the neighborhood. Eventually, she disappeared from the cul-de-sac altogether, her house listed quietly for sale, her possessions cleared out in silence. The street felt different after her departure. Neighbors who had once hidden behind curtains now greeted one another openly. Conversations that had once been whispers grew into casual chats across lawns. Children played more freely, their laughter no longer punctuated by the fear of an angry voice scolding them for stepping too close to the wrong yard. It was as though the entire neighborhood had exhaled at once, releasing months of tension. The man, however, struggled to adjust. The peace he had longed for was finally his, but it felt almost unfamiliar. Each morning he stepped outside expecting to see her car angled across his driveway. Each night he glanced at his cameras, waiting for motion alerts that never came. He had spent so long in a state of vigilance that normalcy felt strange, almost fragile. And yet slowly, life returned. His driveway remained clear. His lawn stayed untouched. His mailbox, once a target, stood pristine. The cameras became less about evidence and more about reassurance. The war was over, and he had won. Not through retaliation or rage, but through patience, persistence, and the undeniable power of truth. Online, the saga lived on. People continued to share his story, using it as a cautionary tale, a viral parable about entitlement and accountability. Some reached out to him with support, others with questions, many simply with their own stories of difficult neighbors. Though he remained private, rarely engaging with the noise, he couldn't escape the feeling that his once quiet life had become part of a larger conversation. But what mattered most was the change at home. The neighborhood, once fractured, found new unity in the aftermath. Block parties were organized, something that hadn't happened in years. Residents who had avoided one another now connected over their shared ordeal. Even the HOA, humbled by their failure to act decisively, loosened their rigid posture and began working more collaboratively with homeowners. The woman's departure had not only removed a source of chaos, it had reminded everyone of the importance of community, of standing together against those who thrived on division and control. For the man, the end of the ordeal brought something deeper than relief. It brought perspective. He had seen firsthand how quickly pride and entitlement could spiral into destruction. He had watched as a simple parking dispute escalated into viral notoriety, legal consequences, and near disaster. And through it all, he had learned the value of patience, of documentation, and of refusing to be dragged down into the chaos of another person's war. Months later, as he sat on his porch in the quiet evening air, he thought back on everything that had happened. The flashing lights of the tow truck, the furious shouts in the street, the shredded flyers on his lawn, the eerie sight of her pouring gasoline under the cover of night. Each memory felt surreal, like a story that had happened to someone else. And yet, the scars on his car, the folders of footage, and the viral clips that still circulated online were proof that it had all been real. But now, the street was calm. The sound of sprinklers clicked softly in the distance. Children rode their bikes past his driveway without fear. Neighbors waved as they passed, offering smiles instead of wary glances. Peace had returned, not because the neighborhood was perfect, but because the storm had finally passed. The man exhaled, the tension that had lived in his chest for months finally loosening. He knew the story of Driveway Karen would live online forever, a viral reminder of suburban drama at its peak. But here, on his quiet street, the story was over. His driveway was his again, his home was safe, and his life, at last, was his own. The war had ended, and peace, long overdue, had finally arrived.